Hello, and you are very welcome to Cut Through the Noise with me, Aisling O'Rourke, the Communications Coach. Cut Through the Noise is the podcast that helps business leaders increase sales through communications and marketing that elevates your brand. This is series 5 of the podcast, so if it's your first time listening, you're very welcome. Please do go back and make sure and check out our back catalogue. In this series, we're focusing in entirely on podcasting for business because let's be honest about it, it kind of feels like everyone has a podcast these days. But how can you as a business leader harness the power of podcasting as part of your marketing strategy? And today we're going to be talking about guesting for podcasting and how that can become part of your marketing strategy. Well, today I'm delighted to be joined by fellow podcaster Aoife O'Brien of the multi-award-winning Happier at Work podcast. Aoife, you are very welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Aisling. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan, so it's an honour to be invited to be a guest on the show.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. Sure, and I promise we're not paying her to say it, listeners. Now, Aoife, you have been podcasting for quite some time with Happier at Work. It's a brand in its own right at this stage. How did it start for you? When did you decide that, you know what, this is where I need to go and I need to be working on this?
Well, I was a huge fan of podcasts. I was listening avidly to podcasts all the time and devouring them, essentially. I would have one podcast and I would listen exactly, as you mentioned earlier, to all of the back catalogue. I would go through each episode one by one. And I just absolutely loved it as a medium for insights, for communication. I just absolutely loved it. And in 2019, I took the brave decision with a microphone and an idea and an internet connection, and I decided to start my own podcast. I didn't admittedly have a strategy in place for it. I didn't really know where I was going to go, but I knew that I had a really important message to share and that I loved podcasting myself, and it would be a great way to communicate my ideas with other people. So that's kind of how it started.
And like you, I absolutely love podcasts. I love storytelling. I grew up in a house where we listened to the radio. We still listen to the radio every day in my family. So for me, podcasting was a very natural transition to that. And what I love about podcasting is the fact that you can really decide and make an active choice on what it is that you are going to, the type of conversation you're going to listen to. You've got you can pick any topic that you want. You don't need to, like with radio, you're just working away with what they decide to put on air. Whereas with podcasting, you get the choice of the topic and how you want to engage with the medium. Now, I mentioned earlier podcast guesting. Talk to me about your experience of podcast guesting and how it's helped in your own marketing for yourself.
Yeah, I think taking a step back, first of all, to talk about, well, why did I get into this in the first place? And because I've been doing the podcast for so long, so at this stage, at the time that we're recording, it's over 5 years since I've had the podcast. When I first started out, I very much kept it to my inner circle, by which I mean just the people I knew. And I reached out to people who were in my network to be guests on the podcast. As the podcast grew over the course of those 5 years, I've had increasing numbers of people reaching out to me directly to say, I'd love to be a guest on your show. And at first, this is great. You think, oh, fantastic. But after a while, when you start to see these repetitive pitches or pitches that are all like, this is about me and this is my book and this is, and it's all centered around them as opposed to centered around like, how does this actually help the audience? They're not pitching in that way. So I kind of got to a stage where I was really sick of just reading all of these, and I thought I can make a difference here and I can educate people on how to do it properly. So even before I even thought about it for my own business, it was more about how can I help people who are pitching to be on the podcast. Like it's a funny one because people don't want to be offended and they're only trying to present themselves in the best way. But I think, and I've made this mistake before, when I'm reaching out to people to be guests on the podcast, I'm like, and the podcast is this, and it has all of these accolades. And, you kind of forget, but you need to put yourself in the other person's shoes and say, why is this actually good for me? What's in it for me by having you as a guest? Or what's in it for me by me being a guest on the podcast? So I suppose I wanted to preface it all by saying that. For me, the beauty, and I'll maybe talk about this in a couple of different ways, because I have a podcast. And if I'm a guest on someone else's podcast, it's a really easy win for me, because if someone's listening to a podcast, they're already in that medium, they're already in that channel. And I can just say, well, why don't you go and check out the Happier at Work podcast, wherever you're listening to this podcast that you're currently listening to, go and check out Happier at Work. And it makes it so much easier, especially with my name and trying to spell out my name or say connect on LinkedIn. It's so much harder to do that. But if I can say, go and check out the Happier at Work podcast, I think a bit more generically for a business owner, exactly going back to your point earlier, Aisling, the idea that we can talk about very, very niche and specific things on podcasts. You can boil it right down to really the area that you want to focus on. And therefore, when you have an audience, that audience is very engaged with the content that you put out there. And so anyone who you bring on to speak on that podcast is going to be perceived as the expert. They're going to add a lot of value to your listeners. And it's a huge opportunity for people to promote their business in that way. And then from your side, you've brought someone in who's talking about things that are really, really important to your clients as well. So I think it's a win-win, and you always need to think about it from that perspective as well.
Like you, I get many requests to appear on Cut Through the Noise, and indeed my radio show on Midlands 103, Let's Go Green. And frequently, unfortunately, it's like, well, can I go on your show? And I could be flattered that this is being offered to me, and I usually am. But when we're pitching ourselves, we need to do it in the same professional way that we would do anything else in life or anything else in business. And you need to think, like Aoife is saying there, you need to think about the value that you can offer that particular show's audience. So like, for instance, if you're in, trains, and you're talking about the electrification of the train network in Ireland, fantastic. For my environmental show, that would be an appropriate pitch. It's not necessarily an appropriate pitch for Cut Through the Noise. And you need to really fine tune how you're approaching and who you're approaching, really, to see, can you be of value to that show or that podcast?
This is exactly it. So I was pitched one time by someone who's a makeup artist, and I sort of feel like, has this person even listened to the podcast? So I'll get a lot of pitches and it's very obvious that they haven't even listened to one episode. I get other pitches where they've maybe picked the most recent episode and said, oh, hey, I just listened to this fantastic episode and they put the person's name and they put the subject in. I've seen people use email marketing, as in they just add your name to a database and then everything else is populated. So you have your name, you have your podcast name, and then the rest is populated. Like, there's so many different scammy, sleazy approaches that people use, when really for me, it boils down to that human connection. And it boils down to, first of all, is this a show that I should be on? Have I listened to it? Am I interested in the content? And are they accepting guests? So first of all, finding the right show to be on. Do your values align with that person? Do you have value to add to that conversation? Is it something that they do? Like, I've heard stories from podcasters saying, podcasters who don't have guests on their show and they receive submission, or they receive kind of guest pitches, and they're like, well, I don't even have guests on my show. So it just goes to show that with a little bit of research, you can actually come across as, like you say, very professional. So finding those right podcasts, first of all, and there's loads of different ways. If you're a podcast listener, do a quick search in whatever podcast app that you use the keywords that you would normally use to search for your business that someone would use. If they were searching for you, for example, ask people within your network, have a look on LinkedIn. There's so many different ways that you can find podcasts, and there's loads of podcast databases as well that you can use. There are free and paid guesting services that you can pay to have a database of podcasts that are looking for guests. But for me, the important thing is not just to blast out a whole load of podcasts. It's really about finding that right one. If you want to do it in kind of a maybe a faster way or an easier way, so you don't have to go out and listen to every single podcast that you want to be on, is do a simple reach out and say, I just wondered what your guest application process is. So you're not lying and say, I've listened to your podcast episode, or I've listened to your podcast, or I'm a big fan. Reach out and say, I'm just wondering, I've just come across your podcast and I'm wondering what your guest application process is.
What are your thoughts on, like, because I know there are services, and we won't name any of them, but there are services where you can pay to be listed and to be matched by, well, artificial intelligence with appropriate, so-called appropriate podcasts that might be looking for guests. What are your thoughts on those kind of services?
I've not used them myself personally. When I was first starting out, I joined lots of different Facebook groups, and that was also a way to connect with people. But what you'll find is there's usually more people looking to be on a podcast than there are people who are looking for guests. I did hear someone else say that any podcast that's kind of worth its salt doesn't need to go on one of those services. There was, and at the time of this recording, there's sunsetting the service. There was a really great tool called Chartable, and you can find out your stats, but you can also search for podcasts within that tool. But they're sunsetting that service now as at the time of recording, so it's not available anymore. But within that service, you could also see the popularity essentially of the podcast. So if it was within, say, the top 10% of podcasts globally, it would have some sort of a ranking, and you could tell, well, how popular or how well is this podcast actually performing. And it's not to say that you only want to be on podcasts that have really high performing. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important to find ones that have that correct niche for you, that you want to add value to, that you have a similar type of audience. Like, that's really, really important. So I think I've deflected slightly your original question. I haven't used those services myself, so I can't comment, but hopefully what I've shared has added some value. Yeah.
I think what you said there is really important. I think, and in my experience, and even as a radio broadcaster, like down over the last 20 or so years, good shows don't need to pay for guests and pay for services that match them up with guests. It's not how it's done in broadcasting. And there's lots of companies out there. And it is, I suppose it's more of an American model. I think it's not as common in Europe to pay to play, essentially. But I think if you're looking at those services, you really need to look at the value you're getting out of the money that you're spending, because like that, they need more of people looking for guests than they do podcasts, looking for guesting opportunities than they do podcast hosts looking for interviewees. So it's not something personally that I recommend, but I do get asked about it a lot, because when we discuss the research that you have to do, people say, oh God, Aisling, that sounds like an awful lot of work. So the advice that I give to my clients is, well, do you know what? Do you have an assistant? Do you have somebody in your team that's really good at research? Could you give them the time to do this project for you, to research for you? Because that will be worth its weight in gold, and you'll get much more ROI on it.
Exactly. And, I think building on one of the points that I made earlier, a lot of podcasters, if they get a cold pitch, they'll just delete it. Now, quite early on, I came up with an application process. So for anyone who wants to be on the podcast, let's say there's two ways. I can invite someone myself, or if someone comes to me, they're going to go through an application process. And one of the first questions is, have you actually listened to the podcast? Like, it's fairly straightforward. However, taking a step back from that, if you are thinking, how do I cut through the noise, and how do I get someone to actually read my pitch? I think a very simple way to stand out from other people is to simply say, are you accepting guest applications? Because for me, it's actually quite flattering that someone might think, wow, your podcast is so popular that there is an entire process associated with that. So and a lot of people don't have this application process. They might just delete something, or people I've spoken to, they're like, I love that idea. I'm going to take that on board, and I'm going to create an application process. So, you'll meet with various different responses from people, but what you don't want is for someone to just delete the email. So the easy way, I think, to do it is, like I say, reach out and simply ask, are you accepting guest applications? Now, that's something that an assistant can do. And of those, how many responses are you actually getting? And how many are positive, as in, here, yes, here is the application process, versus negative? And then those are the ones that you can research in further detail. So you're saving yourself a good bit of time there. You don't have to necessarily listen to every single podcast that you're reaching out to.
And Aoife, you do that pitch. Okay. So you get in contact, either you or a member of your team, you get in contact, you do a bit of research first, you identify a couple of podcasts that you think, do you know what, my target audience listen there, I need to get there. And they say, yes, we'd be delighted to have you. And, you know, this is how it works for us. What then makes a good podcast guest, in your opinion?
I think having really good preparation, having a really clear framework that you want to talk about, something that will be of value to listeners. So if I think about some of the guests that have been on my podcast maybe let's talk about what not to do. I think sometimes it's easier to talk about what not to do. I think one of the big no-nos is to talk about yourself. So someone who I had as a guest very early on, and he talked about this framework, and I thought, wow, this must be a really common framework that everyone knows about. And it was a very specific language that he was using, and he was using it in such a way that I just thought it was a standard thing, because it was quite a generic term. And after the recording, I discovered that actually that's his own proprietary terminology, and the entire podcast was, and this is what I do, and if you want to do this, then you need to come and work with me type of approach. Yeah. So you don't want to make it all about selling yourself. You want to be able to show and share the value that you have. The other thing that I mentioned about having some sort of a framework in place, a recent conversation that I had, which I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to release it as an episode, but just the fact that I'm doubting that I should release it to the world, is again this idea that there was no structure to it, and it felt very much like, I've had this epiphany, I want to help other people who've had this, so get in touch with me to do the work, as opposed to very clear actions that people can take from the podcast today. So you should be adding value to the audience. I think that's the number one thing. Also make it really clear how to connect with you. So I always say, if you're listening to this podcast and if you're interested in workplace culture, managing your career, then check out the Happier at Work podcast. But sometimes people confuse things. They're like, oh, you'll find me on Twitter, and you'll find me on Instagram, and here's my LinkedIn, and here's my website, and oh, here's my email, and sometimes here's my phone number. I think keep it really simple and have a really clear call to action, that like, what is the next step that someone should take after listening to this podcast episode? So there are kind of 2 or 3 big chunky things that people should really consider when it comes to being a guest.
And I'm going to add in a number 4. If you've been a guest on someone else's podcast and they tell you, right, your episode is going to go live tomorrow, here's what we're saying, here's a video clip, or here's an image, you know, please share on your social media. Share on your social media. Be kind. Tag them in your LinkedIn posts or whatever platform you're using. I think, you know, a lot of being a good guest on a podcast is like being a guest in somebody's home. It's about being polite and having some common courtesy and recognizing that, do you know what? They didn't have to have you on their show, but they chose to have you on their show. So just do a social media post, you know, promote them, or maybe connect them with another person who you know would be valuable for their podcast. You know, I think there are 2 things that you can do that genuinely can add value as a guest after the recording has finished. But we should say, Aoife, we're both in agreement that, you know, if you're not yet ready to create a podcast under your own brand, that being a guest on other people's podcasts in your niche is a really valuable marketing tool, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And if I could just build on the point, I was kind of laughing there. I didn't want to laugh too loud. But this idea, it's actually the third step in my podcast guesting mastery program, is all about promoting the podcast, because that's probably the number one question I get asked from other podcasters is, how do you promote your podcast so well? I've been doing it for 5 years now and I've learned a lot, but that's also what I share. And one of the big bugbears, one of the huge frustrations with podcasters is that it's people come on as a guest, and like for me it's this idea of reciprocity. I'm having you as a guest on my podcast with the idea that I'm sharing you with my audience. Now you need to share me with your audience, and that's kind of how it works. But there are so many guests who come on a podcast and who just, they don't do anything. They maybe like your post, or they might comment on it, or share the post that you've created, but they don't create any original content. Now, for the last couple of years, I've really painstakingly created a system where I provide them with everything that they're going to need in order to promote the podcast themselves. I've created a guide that helps people to promote the podcast, and an incentive as well to say, if you want to be recognized as the top 10 episode in the year that we're in, then here's ways that you can promote the episode. And still, people often don't promote the show. What I will say is, by you promoting the podcast episode that you've been on, it helps you to get visible to your target audience, even if they never listen to the episode.
Yeah.
It helps you to get invited onto additional podcasts, because people see, oh, wow, she's a podcast guest. She has experience of doing it. There's so many different ways that you can elevate your brand by being a podcast guest, even if no one even listens to that episode. So it's not about the listener numbers, it's about what you put out there and how you project yourself. It can lead to so many more opportunities. So don't forget that you need to also promote yourself by using the podcast. So you promote the brand of the podcast that you've been on, but you also promote your own business and your personal brand.
And it adds so much credibility to you as an expert in your chosen area to be featured by other experts. And like, it's such a valuable thing to do, that essentially it is free. You're paying your time. Yeah. And, and that is valuable. And I'm not trying to devalue time, but I think if you are organized in how you approach a podcaster or a producer, and you politely pitch or ask, as Aoife suggested, how do I apply to be a guest on your show? And you treat the host and the team, however large it might be, with a bit of common decency and courtesy. You're like, this whole thing, like Aoife was saying, don't be the guest who keeps on saying, well, my business does this and you can work with me by doing that. And in my training programs, I do this, and you really need to pay me before I'm going to give you any valuable information. Yeah. That's just irritating to listen to. So don't do that, please. And then after the fact, promote it, include it in your newsletter, include it in your blog, in your social media platforms. Now, I will say, if any podcasters are listening, remember that certain social media platforms, when you're scheduling posts, don't allow you tag the people that you're talking about in the post. So you do have to go back in and actually manually tag them. LinkedIn, if you're listening, please fix that. It's very annoying. And like, I've had experience where a post was put up, but because the podcast host or the team didn't realize that, I never knew that they'd been promoting it. I didn't realize it had gone out into the public eye. So make sure you do let your guests know when really their podcast episode is going live. Aoife, I could talk to you all day, but thank you so much for joining us on Cut Through the Noise. How do people get in contact with you if they want to find out more about what it is that you do and your podcast, Happier at Work?
Yeah, of course. I think because you're listening to a podcast, definitely go and check out Happier at Work. I mentioned sort of in passing that I have an award-winning program which is called Podcast Guesting Mastery. I will share the link with you, Aisling, and you can put the link in the show notes if people want to find out more about that.
Well, Aoife O'Brien, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining me on Cut Through the Noise. I hope that you've enjoyed my conversation with Aoife today. And of course, thank you for all your support. Cut Through the Noise is shortlisted for the 2024 Irish Pod Awards. We're shortlisted in the Best News and Current Affairs podcast that will be announced in January. So we're all keeping our fingers crossed for that. But all your support is much appreciated. Don't forget to hit that follow button on your preferred podcast app to stay updated on all our episodes. And remember, while content may be king, clarity is key to making sure that you and your brand stand out from the crowd. If I can be of any help with your communications and marketing strategy, don't hesitate to get in contact with us at hello@thecommunicationscoach.ie. Have a great week. We'll be back same time next week with another episode of Cut Through the Noise with Aisling O'Rourke.